The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Carol Wood finally admitted to herself that they were going to die. She pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the abandoned cabin, watching the snow pile higher against the walls, while her 4 children huddled beneath every scrap of fabric they could find. The youngest, barely 2 years old, had stopped crying hours ago, which terrified her more than his earlier wails. 8-year-old Emma tried to keep the others calm, but Carol could see the fear in her daughter's eyes, the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting their father to walk through it at any moment. He wouldn't. Carol had buried William 3 weeks ago, his body broken from the mining accident that had shattered their world. The company had offered nothing but empty condolences and a notice to vacate their company housing within the month. She had taken what little money they had and fled north, chasing rumors of work in the lumber camps. But the wagon had broken down just as the first snows began to fall. Now they were trapped in this derelict trapper's cabin, miles from anywhere, with no food left and no way to signal for help. The wind howled through gaps in the chinked logs, carrying with it the promise of more snow, more cold, more desperation. Carol pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to think of something, anything that might save them. The sound of hoofbeats cutting through the storm made her heart leap with impossible hope. She wiped the frost from the window again, squinting through the swirling snow. A massive figure on horseback materialized from the white chaos, leading a pack mule behind him. Even through the blizzard, she could make out the broad shoulders and confident posture of a man who belonged in this wilderness. He dismounted near the cabin's entrance, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the brutal weather. Carol's hands trembled as she moved away from the window. A stranger approaching in weather like this could mean salvation or something far worse. She had heard stories about the mountain men who lived in these remote places, men who had turned their backs on civilization and its constraints. Some said they were dangerous, unpredictable. Others claimed they were the only ones who truly understood how to survive in the unforgiving wilderness. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The heavy knock on the door echoed through the cabin like thunder. Carol's children pressed closer together, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Emma reached for her mother's hand, her small fingers ice cold. "Who's there?" Carol called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Name's Alexander Carter," came the reply, deep and steady. "Saw smoke from your chimney. You folks in trouble?" Carol hesitated. Everything about their situation screamed trouble, but admitting it to a stranger felt like surrendering the last shred of control she had left. Still, what choice did she have? Her children were depending on her to make the right decision, even if she had no idea what that might be. "We're managing," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. A long silence followed, broken only by the wind's relentless assault on the cabin walls. Then Alexander spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Ma'am, I've been living in these mountains for 15 years. I know the difference between managing and dying. Which one are you doing?" The bluntness of his question cut through her pretenses like a blade. Carol looked at her children, at their hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, at the empty pot hanging over the dying fire. She thought of William, of how he had always told her that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. He had been right then, and he would be right now. "Dying," she whispered, then louder, "We're dying." The door opened, bringing with it a swirl of snow and bitter cold. Alexander Carter stepped inside, and Carol's breath caught in her throat. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with premature gray, and his eyes were the color of winter sky. Everything about him spoke of strength and competence, from the way he moved to the quality of his heavy coat and well-maintained rifle. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, his expression unreadable. Carol felt heat rise in her cheeks as she saw herself through his eyes. A desperate woman with 4 starving children, trapped in a falling-down cabin with nothing left to offer but shame and need. "I've got 4 kids, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Sir," she said, ashamed of how broken she sounded, how completely she had failed them all. Alexander's weathered face broke into an unexpected grin, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish. "Good," he said simply. I've got room for 8. The simplicity of his response left Carol speechless. She had expected judgment, perhaps pity, maybe even rejection. Instead, this mountain man spoke as if taking in a woman and 4 children was the most natural thing in the world. She watched as he moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, assessing their situation with the eye of someone who had faced survival challenges before. "How long is since you've eaten?" he asked, already knowing the answer from the hollow look in their eyes. "2 days," Emma spoke up when Carol couldn't find her voice. "Maybe 3. Mama gave us her portions." Alexander nodded as if this confirmed something he already suspected. Without another word, he went back outside into the storm. Carol heard him moving around, the sound of supplies being unloaded from his pack mule. When he returned, his arms were full of provisions: dried meat, hardtack, coffee, and most miraculously, a small sack of precious sugar. "We needed to get some food into them before we move," he said, already building up the fire with practiced efficiency. "But we can't stay here long. This storm's going to get worse before it gets better, and this cabin won't hold against what's coming." Carol watched him work, noting the way he moved with complete confidence despite the dire circumstances. His hands were scarred and weathered but steady as he prepared a simple meal from his supplies. The children crept closer to the growing fire, drawn by its warmth and the promise of food. "Where would we go?" Carol asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "My place," Alexander said without looking up from the pot he was stirring. "It's about 6 miles north, up in the high country, built to withstand weather like this." The idea of traveling 6 miles through a blizzard with 4 small children seemed impossible. But Carol was beginning to understand that Alexander Carter didn't deal in impossibilities. He dealt in necessities, in what needed to be done regardless of how difficult it might seem. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Alexander paused in his work, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, a shadow of old pain or memory. Then it was gone, replaced by that same steady competence. "These mountains don't care about your story," he said quietly. "They'll kill you just as quick, whether you're a saint or a sinner. But they've been good to me, given me everything I need. Seems only right to pass that along when I can." He ladled the hot stew into whatever containers they could find, making sure each child got a full portion before taking anything for himself. Carol watched her children eat with desperate hunger, colors slowly returning to their pale cheeks. The youngest, little Samuel, actually smiled as he tasted the rich broth, and Carol felt tears she couldn't afford to shed burning behind her eyes. "What's your name, ma'am?" Alexander asked as they ate. "Carol Wood," she replied. "These are my children. Emma, she's 8, Jacob is 6, Mary is 4, and Samuel just turned 2 last month." Alexander nodded to each child in turn, treating them with the same serious respect he showed their mother. "Pleased to meet you all. We'll be neighbors for a while, so we might as well get acquainted." Neighbors. The word implied something temporary, a short-term arrangement until they could get back on their feet. Carol wondered if Alexander truly believed that, or if he was simply being kind. Either way, she was grateful for the illusion of dignity it provided. As they finished eating, Alexander began organizing their few possessions with military precision. He had brought extra blankets and warm clothing from his supplies, items that looked handmade but of excellent quality. Everything he did spoke of careful planning and long experience with emergency situations. "The storm will break sometime tomorrow morning," he said, checking the sky through the window. "We'll leave then. It's going to be hard traveling, especially with the little ones, but we can make it if we're smart about it." Carol nodded, though the prospect filled her with terror. She had never been more than a few miles from town in her entire life, and now she was preparing to venture deep into the wilderness with a man she had known for less than an hour. But what choice did she have? Stay here and watch her children freeze, or trust this stranger who had already shown more kindness than anyone else in weeks? "I should tell you," she said quietly, not wanting the children to hear. "We don't have any money, nothing to pay you with. I know that makes this charity, and I hate that, but—" "Stop," Alexander said firmly. "This isn't charity, it's survival. You help me, I help you. That's how things work up here. How could I possibly help you?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before, almost hesitant. It's been a long time since I've had company. Longer still since I've heard children laughing. Maybe that's worth more than money. There was something in his tone that made Carol look at him more carefully. Beneath the competent exterior, she glimpsed a loneliness that matched her own. This mountain man, for all his strength and self-sufficiency, was as isolated as she was desperate. Perhaps this arrangement would benefit them both in ways neither had expected. The night passed slowly, with Alexander taking watch while the rest of them slept. Carol dozed fitfully, waking periodically to find him silhouetted against the window, his rifle across his knees, keeping vigil against whatever dangers might lurk in the storm. Each time she saw him there, steady and alert, she felt a little of the crushing weight of responsibility lift from her shoulders. Dawn came gray and bitter, but the wind had finally begun to die down. Alexander was already moving, preparing for their departure with the same methodical efficiency he had shown the night before. He fashioned a crude sled from materials in the cabin, something to carry the youngest children when they grew too tired to walk. "The key is staying together," he explained as they prepared to leave. "No matter what happens, we don't get separated. The mountains will forgive a lot of mistakes, but not that one." Carol bundled the children in every layer they possessed, plus the additional clothing Alexander had provided. They looked like small, colorful bundles, barely able to move in all the fabric, but she could see they were warmer than they had been in days. The journey began before full daylight, with Alexander leading the way through snow that came up to Carol's waist in places. He had fashioned snowshoes for all of them, from materials in his pack, crude but functional devices that kept them from sinking completely into the drifts. The children struggled at first, unused to the awkward gait required, but they adapted quickly with the resilience that only the young possessed. Alexander set a steady pace, not fast but relentless, stopping frequently to check on the children and adjust their course based on landmarks only he could see. Carol marveled at his ability to navigate in what looked to her like an endless expanse of white wilderness. Every direction looked the same to her eyes, but he moved with the confidence of someone following a well-known path. "How do you know where we're going?" she asked during one of their brief rests. "The mountains talk to you if you know how to listen," he replied, pointing to subtle variations in the terrain that meant nothing to her. Wind patterns, tree growth, the way the snow drifts. It's all there if you pay attention. As they climbed higher, the landscape became increasingly wild and beautiful. Towering pine trees bent under the weight of snow, creating natural shelters and windbreaks. Rocky outcroppings jutted through the white blanket like ancient monuments, and in the distance, mountain peaks stretched toward a sky that seemed impossibly vast and blue. Despite the harsh conditions, Carol found herself moved by the rural beauty of it all. She had spent her entire life in mining towns and settlements, places where nature had been beaten back and subdued. Here, in Alexander's domain, the wilderness reigned supreme, indifferent to human concerns but magnificent in its power. The children were holding up better than she had dared hope. Emma, as the oldest, had appointed herself assistant guide, helping to keep the younger ones moving and in good spirits. Jacob and Mary treated the journey like an adventure, pointing out animal tracks in the snow and asking Alexander endless questions about the wildlife they might encounter. Even little Samuel seemed energized by the fresh air and change of scenery. But as the morning wore on and the climb grew steeper, Carol began to worry about their pace. Alexander had said 6 miles, but in these conditions, that might as well have been 60. Her legs burned with the effort of walking in snowshoes, and she could see the children beginning to flag despite their initial enthusiasm. "How much further?" she asked during their next rest stop. Alexander studied the terrain ahead, his expression unreadable. "We're about halfway," he said finally. "The hard part's still coming." As if summoned by his words, the wind began to pick up again, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Carol looked back the way they had come, but their tracks were already being obscured by blowing snow. There was no going back now, even if they wanted to. They were committed to this path, for better or worse. Alexander noticed her backward glance and moved closer. "Having second thoughts?" "Every step of the way," Carol admitted. "But what choice do I have?" "There's always a choice," he said quietly. "The question is whether you can live with the consequences." Before she could ask what he meant, A sound echoed across the mountainside that made her blood freeze. It was distant but unmistakable. The howl of wolves, and they were getting closer. Alexander's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His hand went to his rifle, and his eyes swept the tree line with predatory intensity. "We need to move," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Now!" The wolf howls echoed closer now, a haunting chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. Alexander's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the tree line, his experienced eyes searching for movement among the snow-laden branches. Carol felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she gathered her children closer, their small faces pale with sudden fear. "How many?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Pack of 5, maybe 6, Alexander replied without taking his eyes off the forest. "They've been tracking us for the last mile. Probably caught our scent back at the cabin." Emma pressed against her mother's side, her 8-year-old mind grasping the danger even if she didn't fully understand it. Jacob and Mary huddled together on the makeshift sled, while little Samuel began to whimper, sensing the adults' tension. Carol's mouth went dry as she realized how exposed they were on this open slope, with nowhere to run and no shelter in sight. "What do we do?" she asked, hating how helpless she sounded. Alexander was already moving, his actions swift and decisive. He pulled a long rope from his pack and began fashioning it into a rough circle around their small group. "Wolves are smart," he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "They'll test us first, look for weakness. We need to show them we're not easy prey." As if summoned by his words, the first wolf appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was massive, its gray coat almost white against the snow, yellow eyes fixed on their group with predatory intelligence. Carol had never seen a wild wolf before, had never imagined how large they could be, how utterly alien and dangerous they seemed compared to the farm dogs she had known. More wolves emerged from the forest, moving with liquid grace through the deep snow. They formed a loose semicircle around the humans, keeping their distance but clearly coordinating their movements. Alexander positioned himself between the pack and the children, his rifle ready but not yet raised. "Don't run," he said quietly. "Don't make sudden movements. They're deciding whether we're worth the risk." The largest wolf, clearly the pack leader, took a step closer, its lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that seemed impossibly sharp and white. Carol felt every instinct screaming at her to grab her children and flee, but Alexander's steady presence kept her rooted in place. She watched his face, noting the way his eyes never left the alpha wolf, the careful calculation in his expression. "They're hungry," he murmured. "This storm's been hard on them too. Probably haven't had a decent meal in days." The thought that she and her children might become that meal sent ice through Carol's veins. She thought of William, of how he had always promised to protect them, and felt the crushing weight of her failure. She had led her children into this wilderness, into this danger, all because she had been too proud to accept help from the mining company, too stubborn to admit she couldn't manage alone. Alexander seemed to sense her spiraling thoughts. "Stay calm," he said, his voice carrying an authority that cut through her panic. "I've dealt with wolves before. They're not mindless killers. They're survivors, just like us." The alpha wolf let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The other pack members responded, shifting their positions, tightening the circle. Carol could see the intelligence in their movements, the way they communicated without sound, and realized with growing horror that they were being hunted by creatures far more sophisticated than she had imagined. "Alexander," she breathed, but he held up a hand for silence. The mountain man began to speak, but not to her. His voice rose in what sounded almost like song, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language Carol didn't recognize. The wolves' ears pricked forward, their aggressive posturing shifting to something more like curiosity. Alexander continued his strange vocalization. His eyes locked on the alphas, and gradually the tension in the air began to shift. "What are you doing?" Carol whispered. "Talking to them," Alexander replied, without breaking his gaze from the lead wolf. "The Lakota taught me years ago. Wolves understand respect, understand strength, but they also understand when someone speaks their language." The alpha wolf tilted its head, listening to Alexander's chanting with an almost human expression of consideration. The other pack members remained alert, but no longer seemed poised to attack. Carol watched in amazement as this mountain man, this stranger who had appeared in their darkest hour, somehow communicated with these wild predators on their own terms. But the moment of connection was shattered by little Samuel's frightened cry. The 2-year-old had been silent too long, overwhelmed by the cold and fear, and now he began to wail with the piercing intensity that only a terrified child could produce. The sound cut through the mountain air like a blade, and the wolf's demeanor changed instantly. The alpha's ears flattened against its skull, its hackles rising as the pack responded to what they interpreted as the cry of wounded prey. The careful balance Alexander had achieved crumbled in seconds, and suddenly the wolves that were moving, no longer curious but predatory, closing the distance with deadly intent. "Get behind me," Alexander commanded, his rifle coming up in one fluid motion. "All of you, now." Carol scooped up Samuel, his cries muffled against her shoulder, while Emma herded the other children behind Alexander's broad frame. The mountain man stood like a fortress between them and the advancing pack, his weapons steady despite the impossible odds. 6 wolves against 1 man, and Carol realized with sick certainty that even Alexander Carter's legendary skills might not be enough. The first wolf lunged just as Alexander's rifle cracked like thunder across the mountainside. The animal twisted in midair, Alexander's shot taking it high in the shoulder, sending it tumbling into the snow with a yelp of pain and rage. But the others kept coming, spreading out to attack from multiple angles, their pack tactics honed by countless hunts. Alexander worked the bolt action with practiced speed, but Carol could see the mathematics of the situation as clearly as he could. 6 shots, maybe 7 if he was lucky, against a coordinated pack that had already learned to fear his weapon. Even if every shot found its mark, which seemed impossible in the chaos of a wolf attack, he might not be able to reload before they were overwhelmed. The wounded wolf struggled to its feet, blood staining the snow beneath it. But rather than retreating, it snarled with increased fury. The pack leader let out a howl that was answered by its remaining companions, and Carol realized with growing horror that wounding one of them had only made the others more determined. "There's too many," she said, stating the obvious because she couldn't think of anything else to say. "Maybe," Alexander replied, his voice steady as he tracked the alpha with his rifle sights. "But they don't know that yet." He fired again, this shot deliberately wide, the bullet whining off a nearby rock. The wolves scattered at the sound, their predatory confidence shaken by the demonstration of the rifle's range and power. Alexander used the moment of confusion to grab a burning branch from their small fire, waving it in a wide arc that sent sparks cascading through the air. "Fire," he said, as much to himself as to Carol. "They're still wild enough to fear fire." But even as he spoke, Carol could see the pack regrouping, their initial surprise fading as they realized the humans had limited ammunition and only 1 torch. The wounded wolf had rejoined its companions, its injury making it more dangerous rather than less, driven by pain and fury to prove its worth to the pack. The alpha began to circle, testing their defenses, looking for an opening. Alexander turned with it, keeping the rifle trained on the massive predator. But Carol could see the other wolves positioning themselves beyond his field of vision. They were being outmaneuvered by creatures that had perfected the art of pack hunting over thousands of years. "Mama," Emma whispered, her small hand clutching Carol's coat. "Are we going to die?" The question hit Carol like a physical blow. She looked down at her daughter's face, saw the trust there despite the fear, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had been thinking like a victim, waiting for Alexander to save them, depending on his strength and skill, while contributing nothing but additional burden. But these were her children, her responsibility, and she would not let them die because she was too frightened or too helpless to act. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "We are not going to die." She set Samuel down carefully behind a fallen log, then began gathering stones from the ground around their position. They were mostly buried in snow, but she could feel them beneath the white surface, solid and substantial. Emma watched her mother's actions and immediately understood, beginning to help gather ammunition for their desperate defense. "What are you doing?" Alexander asked, not taking his eyes off the circling wolves. "Fighting back," Carol replied, testing the weight of a stone in her hand. I may not be able to shoot, but I can throw rocks as well as anyone. Alexander's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. Good, he said simply. We'll need every advantage we can get. The alpha wolf seemed to sense the change in their prey's demeanor. Its circling became more aggressive, more testing, as if it could smell the shift from helpless fear to determined resistance. The other pack members responded to their leader's energy, moving closer, their yellow eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. Carol positioned herself to Alexander's left, her arm cocked back with a fist-sized stone. Emma stood beside her, smaller rocks clutched in both hands, her young face set with grim determination. Even Jacob and Mary had found stones of their own, though Carol prayed they wouldn't need to use them. When they come, Alexander said quietly, aim for the eyes and the nose. Make every throw count. The attack came from 3 directions at once. The alpha charged straight ahead while 2 others flanked them from the sides, their coordination perfect and deadly. Alexander's rifle boomed, taking the leftmost wolf in the chest, but the other 2 kept coming, their powerful legs driving them through the snow with terrifying speed. Carol's stone caught the alpha square in the muzzle, just as it gathered itself to leap. The wolf's head snapped back. Its trajectory altered enough that it crashed into the snow beside them rather than landing among the children. Emma's smaller stone struck one of its eyes, and the great predator rolled away with a howl of pain and fury. But the third wolf had found its mark. It slammed into Alexander's right side, its weight and momentum sending both man and beast tumbling into the snow. The rifle went flying, landing several feet away in a drift that might as well have been miles given the circumstances. Carol watched in horror as Alexander and the wolf rolled together, the mountain man's hands locked around the creature's throat while its claws raked at his heavy coat. The remaining wolves, emboldened by their companion's success, began to close in for the kill. Carol found herself standing between them and her children, stones in both hands, facing down predators that outweighed her by 50 pounds each. She thought of William, of his quiet strength and unwavering protection, and felt his presence somehow lending her courage. "Get back," she snarled at the approaching wolves, her voice carrying a maternal ferocity that surprised even her. "These are my children." The wounded alpha wolf shook its massive head, blood streaming from its injured eye, but its remaining eye burned with undiminished hunger and rage. Carol could see her own death reflected in that yellow gaze, could imagine those terrible teeth tearing into her flesh, but she refused to give ground. Behind her, she could hear Samuel crying and Emma trying to comfort him, the sounds of her children giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Alexander was still locked in mortal combat with the wolf that had brought him down. The creature's jaws snapped inches from his throat while he fought to keep it at bay with hands that were already bleeding from its claws. His rifle lay tantalizingly close but impossibly far, buried in snow that seemed to mock their desperate situation. 2 more wolves had joined the circle now, their pack instincts telling them that the humans' defenses were crumbling. Carol threw another stone, striking one of them in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. These were not dogs to be frightened by thrown objects. These were apex predators who had decided that the potential meal was worth the risk. The alpha gathered itself for another charge, its powerful haunches coiling like springs. Carol knew she had perhaps seconds left, that her next throw would determine whether her children lived or died. She selected her largest stone, feeling its weight, calculating the distance and trajectory with desperate precision. But before either she or the wolf could move, a new sound echoed across the mountainside. It was a howl, but different from the pack's calls, deeper and more resonant. The attacking wolves froze, their ears pricked forward, confusion replacing aggression in their postures. Even the alpha paused, its head turning toward the sound. From the tree line emerged a figure that made Carol's breath catch in her throat. It was another wolf, but larger than any of the pack, its coat a silver gray that seemed to shimmer in the pale mountain light. This newcomer moved with an authority that was immediately apparent, its very presence changing the dynamics of the encounter. The pack wolves whined and lowered their heads in submission as the silver wolf approached. It was clearly an elder, a leader whose status transcended simple pack hierarchy. Carol watched in amazement as the aggressive predators that had been seconds away from killing them all suddenly became deferential, almost puppy-like in their behavior toward this magnificent creature. Alexander managed to throw off his attacker during the distraction, rolling away and coming up in a crouch near his rifle. But he made no move to grab the weapon, seemingly as mesmerized by the silver wolf's appearance as everyone else. The mountain man's eyes held a recognition that Carol didn't understand, as if he knew this creature from somewhere in his past. The silver wolf approached the wounded alpha, touching noses with the smaller predator in what appeared to be a gesture of communication. The pack leader's aggressive posture melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. After a moment of this silent exchange, the alpha backed away, its tail low, and the other pack members followed suit. But the silver wolf was not finished. It turned its attention to the humans, studying them with intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Its eyes, a pale blue that reminded Carol of winter sky, fixed on Alexander with unmistakable recognition. The mountain man slowly straightened, his hands open and empty, and spoke in that same strange language he had used before. The conversation, if it could be called that, lasted only moments. The silver wolf listened to Alexander's words, then responded with a series of low growls and whines that somehow conveyed meaning. Carol found herself holding her breath, witnessing something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Finally, the silver wolf turned and trotted back toward the tree line. The pack followed without question, even the wounded alpha, their earlier aggression completely forgotten. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the forest as silently as they had come, leaving only tracks in the snow to prove the encounter had been real. Carol stood in the sudden silence, her stone still clutched in her hand, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Alexander retrieved his rifle and checked it for damage, his movements automatic while his mind was clearly elsewhere. The children clustered around their mother, their fear gradually giving way to amazement at their unexpected salvation. "What just happened?" Carol finally managed to ask. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring at the spot where the silver wolf had disappeared. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that spoke of old stories and older debts. "That was Ghostwalker," he said simply. "I saved her mate from a trap about 10 years ago. Guess she remembered." The simplicity of his explanation somehow made the miraculous encounter seem both more and less believable. Carol looked at this mountain man who spoke to wolves and had apparently earned the gratitude of a creature that most people would consider nothing more than a dangerous predator. She was beginning to understand that Alexander Carter's relationship with these mountains ran deeper than mere survival skills. "Ghostwalker?" Emma asked, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "The Lakota named her," Alexander explained, shouldering his pack as he prepared to resume their journey. "She's been the matriarch of this territory for longer than anyone can remember. Some say she's more spirit than wolf, that she watches over the mountain and decides who belongs here." Carol felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "And she decided we belong?" Alexander's weathered face creased in something that might have been a smile. "Seems that way, though I suspect it had more to do with the children than with us adults. Ghostwalker has a soft spot for the young and helpless." The characterization stung, but Carol couldn't argue with its accuracy. They were young and helpless, dependent entirely on Alexander's knowledge and skills for their survival. But something had changed during the wolf encounter, some fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her situation. She had faced down predators to protect her children, had found courage she didn't know she possessed. As they resumed their trek through the snow, Carol found herself walking with more confidence despite her exhaustion. The children seemed energized by their adventure, chattering quietly about the magnificent silver wolf and their narrow escape. Even little Samuel had stopped crying, content to ride on the sled while his siblings walked beside him. The terrain grew steadily steeper as they climbed higher into the mountains. Alexander's promised cabin remained invisible ahead of them, hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Carol's legs burned with the effort of walking in snowshoes, and she could see the children beginning to flag, despite their earlier excitement. But there was something different about their group now, a sense of shared purpose that hadn't existed before the wolf encounter. They had faced danger together and survived, had proven to themselves and each other that they were capable of more than they had imagined. Alexander seemed to sense the change as well, his manner toward Carol shifting from protective caution to something approaching partnership. "How much further?" she asked during their next rest stop, but this time the question came from curiosity rather than desperation. "About 2 miles," Alexander replied, pointing toward a ridge that seemed impossibly distant. "We'll follow that creek bed up to the high meadow. Then it's just a short climb to the cabin." Carol studied the route he indicated, trying to see it through his experienced eyes. To her, it looked like an endless expanse of white wilderness, but she was beginning to trust his judgment about such things. If Alexander Carter said they could make it, then they would make it. The children had found a second wind, energized by the knowledge that their destination was finally within reach. Emma had appointed herself as assistant guide, helping to keep the younger ones motivated and moving. Jacob and Mary competed to see who could spot the most animal tracks in the snow, while Samuel dozed contentedly on his sled. As they resumed their climb, Carol found herself studying Alexander more carefully. There was something about the way he moved through this landscape, the casual competence with which he navigated obstacles and read the terrain, that spoke of more than mere survival skills. This man belonged here in a way that went beyond simple familiarity. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked as they made their way along the frozen creek bed. 15 years, Alexander replied without hesitation. "Came up here after the war, looking for somewhere quiet." The war. Carol realized she knew almost nothing about this man's past, about what had driven him to seek solitude in these remote mountains. There were stories about men who had come west after the fighting ended, veterans who couldn't find their place in the peacetime world and had chosen exile over the struggle to fit in. "Were you at Gettysburg?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his expression tighten. "Antietam," he said quietly, "and Fredericksburg, and a dozen other places I try not to remember." The weight of old pain in his voice made Carol wish she could take back her curiosity. She had heard stories about the war, about the terrible battles that had torn the country apart, but she had never met someone who had lived through that hell. Looking at Alexander now, she could see the shadows those experiences had left behind, the reasons why a man might choose the company of wolves over the society of his fellow humans. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have asked." "It's all right," Alexander replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It was a long time ago. Different life, different man." But Carol could see that it wasn't all right, that the memories still haunted him despite the years that had passed. She wondered what horrors he had witnessed, what losses he had endured, what guilt or grief had driven him to seek refuge in these isolated peaks. The man who had appeared like salvation in their darkest hour carried his own darkness, his own burden of survival. The understanding created an unexpected bond between them. They were both refugees in their own way, both seeking escape from pasts that had become unbearable. Carol had fled the mining town and its reminders of William's death, while Alexander had fled whatever demons the war had left behind. Perhaps that was why he had been so quick to help them, recognizing in their desperation something of his own need for redemption. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower across the snow when they finally reached the high meadow Alexander had promised. It was a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded by towering peaks and filled with snow that sparkled like diamonds in the golden light. And there, nestled against the far slope like something from a fairy tale, stood Alexander's cabin. It was larger than Carol had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of careful craftsmanship and serious intent to withstand whatever weather the mountains could deliver. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, indicating that someone had been maintaining the fire in their absence, and the windows glowed with warm yellow light that promised shelter and safety. "Someone's there," Carol observed, feeling a flutter of anxiety about meeting another stranger. "That'll be Henry Lopez," Alexander said, his tone suggesting this was expected. "He's been looking after the place while I was away. Good man, though he doesn't talk much." As they approached the cabin, the door opened to reveal a compact man with graying hair and skin weathered by decades of mountain living. He studied their small procession with dark eyes that missed nothing, taking in Carol's exhausted condition and the children's obvious need for warmth and food. "Found some strays," Alexander announces, as if rescuing families from blizzards was a routine occurrence. Henry Lopez nodded once, stepping aside to let them enter. "Figured you might," he said in a voice roughened by years of sparse use. got stew on the fire and beds ready. The interior of the cabin was a revelation, and what Carol had expected to be a crude shelter was instead a carefully crafted home, with furniture that spoke of skilled woodworking and attention to detail. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, filled with a fire that radiated blessed warmth throughout the space. The smell of cooking food made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. The children stood uncertainly in the doorway, overwhelmed by the transition from desperate survival to unexpected comfort. Alexander moved among them with gentle efficiency, helping them out of their snow-caked outer garments and guiding them toward the fire. Henry disappeared into what appeared to be a kitchen area, returning with bowls of rich stew that made Carol's mouth water. "Sit," Alexander commanded, and for once Carol was grateful to follow orders. She sank into a chair that felt like luxury after days of sleeping on hard ground, watching her children eat with an appetite that spoke of their body's desperate need for nourishment. As the immediate crisis of cold and hunger was addressed, Carol found herself able to truly look at their surroundings for the first time. This was not the rough bachelor quarters she had imagined, but a home built with care and attention to comfort. There were books on shelves, curtains at the windows, even what appeared to be a piano in one corner. "This is beautiful," she said, meaning it. Alexander seemed almost embarrassed by the compliment. "Had a lot of time to work on it," he said gruffly. "Not much else to do during the long winters." But Carol could see that it was more than just a way to pass time. This cabin represented something deeper, a man's attempt to create beauty and order in a world that had shown him too much ugliness and chaos. Every carefully fitted joint, every thoughtfully placed window, spoke of someone trying to heal old wounds through the act of creation. Henry Lopez moved quietly in the background, tending to practical matters with the efficiency of long practice. He prepared sleeping areas for the children, checked their small injuries from the day's travel, and generally made himself useful without drawing attention to his efforts. Carol found herself grateful for his presence, sensing that Alexander's solitary nature might have made him less prepared for the practical needs of a family. As evening settled over the mountains and the children finally succumbed to exhaustion, Carol found herself alone with the two men by the fire. The silence was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the crackling of burning wood and the distant sound of wind in the pines outside. "Thank you," she said finally, the words encompassing far more than simple gratitude for shelter. Alexander nodded, staring into the flames. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said quietly. "Winter's got a few months left in it, and traveling with children in this weather is risky business." The offer was generous, but Carol could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the way he was already second-guessing his impulse to help. She realized that taking in a woman and 4 children represented a massive disruption to the carefully ordered solitude he had built for himself. The question was whether that disruption would prove to be healing or destructive for a man still carrying the scars of war. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them all of the harsh world beyond these walls. But inside, by the fire, surrounded by the evidence of one man's determination to create something good and lasting, Carol allowed herself to hope that perhaps they had found more than just shelter from the storm. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Carol with its naturalness. The harsh mountain winter that had seemed like an enemy became a cocoon, wrapping their small community in enforced intimacy that gradually transformed strangers into something approaching family. Alexander's cabin, designed for solitary living, expanded to accommodate their needs through small, daily adaptations and unspoken agreements about space and privacy. Carol found herself taking on the domestic responsibilities that came naturally to her, cooking meals from Alexander's well-stocked pantry and mending clothes by the fire while the children played quietly nearby. Henry Lopez proved to be a gentle presence with the little ones, teaching Jacob to whittle and showing Mary how to identify different types of wood by their grain. Even Alexander, despite his initial awkwardness around children, began to thaw under their persistent curiosity and affection. The transformation was most evident in the evenings, when the day's work was done and they gathered around the great stone fireplace. Alexander would read aloud from his collection of books, his deep voice bringing stories to life in a way that held even little Samuel spellbound. Carol watched these moments with wonder, seeing her children's faces bright with imagination. their earlier trauma beginning to heal in the warmth of unexpected security. But it was the conversations after the children were asleep that revealed the deeper changes taking place. Carol and Alexander would sit by the dying fire, speaking in low voices about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of their past with the careful deliberation of people learning to trust again. She told him about William, about their dreams of building something lasting together, about the crushing weight of responsibility she had carried since his death. He spoke sparingly of the war, of the friends he had lost, and the guilt that had driven him to these mountains. But each revelation was a gift of vulnerability that brought them closer. Henry Lopez observed these developments with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood the healing power of human connection. He had been Alexander's only companion for years, watching his friend struggle with isolation and old wounds that refused to heal. The presence of Carol and her children was working a transformation that Henry had hoped for but never dared to expect. The first real test of their arrangements came when the children fell ill with a fever that swept through the cabin like wildfire. Carol found herself torn between four sick children and her own growing weakness as the illness claimed her as well. It was Alexander who stepped into the breach, his battlefield experience with sickness and injury proving invaluable as he nursed them all with patient competence. For 3 days and nights, he barely slept, moving between bedsides with cool cloths and herbal remedies, monitoring temperatures and administering the careful doses of medicine that meant the difference between recovery and disaster. Carol, delirious with fever, was dimly aware of his presence, of gentle hands adjusting blankets and a steady voice murmuring reassurances in the darkness. When the fever finally broke, she awoke to find Alexander asleep in a chair beside her bed, his face drawn with exhaustion, but peaceful in a way she had never seen before. The sight of this strong man, worn down by caring for her family, moved her in ways she struggled to understand. It was more than gratitude, deeper than simple appreciation for his help. It was recognition of something fundamental about his character, about the kind of man who would sacrifice his own comfort for the welfare of others. The recovery period brought new intimacies and understandings. Alexander taught the older children to read the weather signs and identify edible plants, skills that might save their lives if they were ever alone in the wilderness again. Carol found herself working beside him in the kitchen garden he maintained even in winter, learning to preserve food and manage the complex logistics of mountain living. But it was during the long evenings of recuperation that the most significant conversations took place. Carol began to speak more openly about her fears, about the crushing sense of inadequacy that had driven her to make increasingly desperate choices after William's death. Alexander listened without judgment, his own experiences with failure and loss creating a bridge of understanding between them. One particularly clear night, when the children were finally sleeping peacefully and Henry had retired to his own small cabin nearby, Carol found herself alone with Alexander by the fire. The silence between them had grown comfortable over the weeks, but tonight it carried a weight of unspoken possibilities that made her heart race with something that was not entirely fear. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, not sure how to voice the thoughts that had been growing in her mind, "about what happens when spring comes." Alexander's expression didn't change, but she saw the slight tension that entered his shoulders, the way his hands stilled on the piece of wood he had been carving. "What about it?" "The children are settled here, happy. They've been through so much change, so much loss." Carol paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "I don't want to uproot them again unless I have to." "This isn't exactly civilization," Alexander pointed out, though his tone suggested he was testing her resolve rather than discouraging her. "No school, no church, no other families for miles. I can teach them to read and write. You've already taught them more about survival and self-reliance than any school could. As for church," Carol smiled slightly, "I think we've seen enough of God's work in these mountains to know he doesn't require a building." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression she couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made her chest tighten with emotion. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly. "This is a hard life, isolated and demanding. The winters are long and dark, the summers short and intense. There's no going back to town when things get difficult, no neighbors to call on for help. I know, Carol replied, meaning it, but I also know that my children are safer and happier here than they've been anywhere else since their father died. And I know that you and Henry have become more family to them than anyone we left behind. The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine directly. But Carol could see the impact it had on Alexander, the way his careful composure wavered for just a moment before he regained control. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you want?" The question was simple but profound, cutting through all the practical considerations to the heart of her desires. Carol realized that it had been months since anyone had asked her what she wanted, rather than what she needed or what was best for her children. The freedom to consider her own happiness felt both liberating and terrifying. "I want to stay," she said simply. "I want to build something here, something lasting. I want my children to grow up strong and capable, the way you and Henry are strong and capable. And I want—" She hesitated, then forged ahead with characteristic determination. "I want to help you heal from whatever wounds brought you to these mountains." Alexander's intake of breath was sharp and audible. For a moment, his carefully maintained emotional distance cracked, revealing the depth of longing and fear that lay beneath his stoic exterior. Carol saw years of isolation and self-imposed exile in his eyes, along with a desperate hunger for connection that he had convinced himself he didn't deserve. "You don't understand what you're offering," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not the same man I was before the war. There are things I've done, things I've seen that changed me in ways that can't be undone." "We're all changed by what we've endured," Carol replied gently. "But that doesn't mean we're broken beyond repair. You saved my children's lives, Alexander. You gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. Whatever darkness you carry from your past, it hasn't destroyed the goodness in you." The conversation continued deep into the night, both of them circling around truths they were afraid to voice directly. But by the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, something fundamental had shifted between them. They had crossed a threshold from mutual dependence to something deeper and more permanent. The next morning brought a spring-like warmth that set the snow to melting and filled the air with the sound of running water. Alexander announced that he would be making a trip to the nearest trading post, a journey that would take several days, but was necessary to replenish their supplies and gather news from the outside world. "I'll come with you," Carol said immediately, but Alexander shook his head. "Too dangerous with the snow melting. Creek crossings will be treacherous, and the trails are unpredictable this time of year. Henry can look after the children." Carol wanted to argue, but she could see the logic in his reasoning. Still, the thought of him traveling alone through potentially dangerous terrain filled her with anxiety she hadn't expected. When had his safety become so important to her? When had the thought of losing him become as terrifying as the thought of losing one of her children? The morning of his departure was crisp and clear, with the promise of warmer weather and the bright sunshine that painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Alexander packed his supplies with characteristic efficiency while the children gathered around to say goodbye. Even little Samuel seemed to understand that this departure was different from Alexander's usual hunting trips, clinging to the mountain man's leg with unusual persistence. "Bring us something from town," Emma requested, her 8-year-old practicality asserting itself even in the emotional moment. "I'll see what I can find," Alexander promised, ruffling her hair with unusual gentleness. Carol walked with him to where his horse waited, loaded with trade goods and supplies for the journey. The animal was a sturdy mountain-bred gelding, sure-footed and reliable, but Carol still found herself cataloging all the things that could go wrong on a solo journey through wilderness terrain. "Be careful," she said, hating how inadequate the words sounded. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing her features. "I'll be back in a week," he said quietly. "Maybe less if the weather holds." "Promise me," Carol said, surprising herself with the intensity in her voice. "I promise," Alexander replied, and something in his tone suggested the words carried more weight than a simple reassurance about his return. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, disappearing into the forest with the easy competence that characterized all his movements. Carol stood watching long after he had vanished from sight, feeling an emptiness that had nothing to do with practical concerns about their safety. The days that followed Alexander's departure passed slowly, marked by an underlying tension that had nothing to do with their physical security. Henry Lopez proved more than capable of maintaining their routine, and the children adapted to Alexander's absence with the resilience that had carried them through so many changes. But Carol found herself listening for hoofbeats, watching the trail for signs of his return, counting the hours until his promised week had passed. It was Henry who finally voiced what she was afraid to acknowledge. "He'll be back," the older man said quietly as they worked together in the garden on the fifth day. "Alexander Carter doesn't make promises lightly." "I know," Carol replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Do you?" Henry's dark eyes studied her with uncomfortable perception. "Because you're acting like a woman who's afraid she's lost something precious." The observation hit closer to home than Carol was prepared to admit. When had Alexander become precious to her? When had the thought of a future without him become unbearable? She had told herself that her feelings were based on gratitude and practical dependence, but Henry's words forced her to confront the deeper truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Alexander Carter, had perhaps already fallen completely. The realization should have been terrifying, coming so soon after William's death and in circumstances that offered no guarantees about the future. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, explaining the sense of rightness she felt in this mountain cabin, the piece that had gradually replaced the desperate fear that had driven her here. The sixth day brought clouds and the threat of more snow, along with a visitor that none of them had expected. Carol was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of an approaching horse, her heart leaping with the hope that Alexander had returned early. But the rider who emerged from the tree line was a stranger, a lean man in city clothes who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the wilderness setting. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat politely, "I'm looking for a woman named Carol Wood and her 4 children. I was told they might be found in these parts." Carol's blood turned to ice. There was only one reason someone would be looking for her specifically, only one connection to her past that would bring a stranger to this remote location. The mining company had found her. "Who's asking?" she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Name's William Sanchez," the man said, dismounting from his horse with obvious relief. "I represent the Consolidated Mining Company. We've been trying to locate Mrs. Wood regarding her late husband's employment." Henry Lopez appeared beside Carol as if from nowhere, his presence solid and reassuring. The older man's hand rested casually on the rifle he carried, and his dark eyes never left the stranger's face. "What kind of business?" Henry asked, his voice carrying a note of warning that made the visitor shift uncomfortably. William Sanchez reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an official-looking document. "Mrs. Wood's husband died in a mining accident 3 weeks before his pension would have vested. However, the company has decided to honor his service by providing a settlement for his widow and children." Carol stared at the paper he offered, unable to process what she was hearing. After weeks of abandonment and desperate flight, after watching her children nearly starve while the company that had killed their father offered nothing but empty condolences, they were suddenly interested in providing assistance? "How much?" she asked, though the question felt like betrayal of everything she had found in these mountains. $500, Sanchez replied, as if the sum should be impressive. More than enough to relocate somewhere with better opportunities for the children. Schools, churches, proper medical care. $500. It was more money than Carol had ever seen at one time, enough to buy passage to California or Oregon, enough to start over in a real town with real prospects for her children's future. It was everything she had dreamed of during those desperate weeks after William's death. The answer to prayer she had stopped believing would be answered. So why did the offer feel like a trap? "That's very generous," she said carefully, not taking the document from his outstretched hand. "But I'll need time to consider it." Sanchez's expression tightened slightly. "I'm afraid the offer has certain time constraints, Mrs. Wood. The company is prepared to provide transportation and assistance with relocation, but only if you're ready to leave immediately." Immediately? Carol felt Henry's tension increase beside her, saw the way his grip on his rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. "There's a supply wagon leaving for Denver tomorrow morning," Sanchez explained. "If you're interested in the company's offer, you and your children would need to be ready to travel by then." The pressure tactics were obvious now. The way the supposed generosity came with the strings attached, that would force her to abandon everything she had built here. Carol thought of Alexander, somewhere on the trail between here and the trading post, unaware that his world was about to be torn apart by corporate manipulation. "I said I need time to think," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "The children are settled here, and I have commitments to the people who have been helping us." Sanchez's polite facade slipped slightly. "Mrs. Wood, I think you're failing to understand the reality of your situation. This is wilderness, miles from civilization. Your children need proper schooling, medical care, opportunities for advancement. What kind of future can they have in a place like this?" "A future where they're loved and safe," Carol replied without hesitation. "Where they're taught to be strong and self-reliant instead of dependent on the charity of companies that view them as liabilities." The mining company representative's expression hardened. "The offer won't be extended indefinitely, Mrs. Wood. This is a one-time opportunity to provide for your children's welfare." "Then you'll have my answer when I'm ready to give it," Carol said firmly. "Not before." Sanchez remounted his horse with obvious frustration. "I'll be camped at the old trapper's cabin where we found evidence of your stay," he said. "One day, Mrs. Wood. That's all the time I can give you." He rode away without another word, leaving Carol and Henry standing in the sudden silence of his departure. The older man's weathered face was grim as he watched the stranger disappear into the forest. "Company man," Henry said, as if the words tasted bitter. "They don't give up easy when they want something." "What do they want?" Carol asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You gone," Henry replied bluntly. "Question is, what do you want?" Carol spent the rest of the day in a state of turmoil that she tried to hide from the children. The mining company's offer represented everything she had thought she wanted: security, opportunity, a chance for her children to have normal lives in a civilized community. $500 was more than enough to establish them somewhere with schools and churches and neighbors, all the things that proper mothers were supposed to want for their children. But the thought of leaving filled her with a despair that surprised her with its intensity. This mountain cabin had become more than shelter. It had become home in a way that nowhere else had ever been. Alexander and Henry had become more than benefactors. They had become family. The idea of explaining to Emma and Jacob and Mary and little Samuel that they had to leave again, had to start over somewhere else, felt like a betrayal of the stability she had promised them. As evening approached and there was still no sign of Alexander's return, Carol found herself pacing the cabin like a caged animal. The children sensed her distress despite her efforts to appear calm, their own anxiety manifesting in unusual clinginess and subdued behavior. Even Samuel, normally cheerful and active, spent the evening curled in her lap, as if sensing that their world was once again in jeopardy. Henry Lopez said little, but his presence was a steadying influence as Carol wrestled with her decision. The older man understood the complexities of the situation without needing them explained, his years in the mountains having taught him to read the subtle signs of human distress as easily as he read weather patterns. "Alexander should be back tomorrow," he said quietly as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep. "What if he's not?" Carol asked, voicing the fear that had been growing all day. "What if something's happened to him?" "Then we deal with it," Henry replied with characteristic pragmatism. "But borrowing trouble doesn't help anyone." Carol knew he was right, but the uncertainty was eating at her. Everything depended on Alexander's return, on his presence to anchor the decision she was trying to make. Without him, the choice between security and happiness became impossibly complex. The night passed slowly, filled with restless sleep and anxious dreams. Carol woke before dawn, drawn to the window by sounds she couldn't quite identify. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see movement in the forest, shadows that might have been deer or might have been something more threatening. But as the light grew stronger, she realized with a surge of relief that the movement was Alexander's horse, picking its way carefully down the mountain trail with its familiar rider upright in the saddle. He was back, safe and whole, and the sight of him filled Carol with joy that had nothing to do with practical considerations about her decision. She was waiting on the porch when he rode into the clearing, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and anticipation. Alexander looked tired but unharmed, his weathered face creasing into a smile when he saw her standing there. Miss me? He asked as he dismounted, his tone light but his eyes serious. More than I should have, Carol replied honestly, not caring what her admission revealed about her feelings. Alexander's expression grew more serious as he took in her obvious distress. What's happened? Carol told him about William Sanchez's visit, about the mining company's offer and the deadline they had imposed. She watched his face change as she spoke, saw the careful control that came over his features as he processed the implications of her news. $500, he said when she finished. That's a lot of money. Yes, Carol agreed, waiting for him to say more. Enough to start over anywhere you wanted. Give the children opportunities they'll never have here. Yes, Carol said again, her heart sinking at the neutrality in his voice. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had been his refuge for so many years. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were discussing someone else's problem rather than his own potential heartbreak. You have to do what's best for them, he said finally. They're your children, your responsibility. I won't stand in the way of their future. The noble sacrifice in his words made Carol want to shake him. Here was this man who had saved their lives, who had opened his home and his heart to them, preparing to let them go with a way to fight, because he thought it was the right thing to do. His selflessness was both admirable and infuriating. What if I don't want to go? She asked quietly. Alexander's control cracked slightly, revealing the hope and fear warring in his expression. What about the children's future? Their education, their chances in life? What about their happiness? Carol countered. What about the family we've built here? What about love? The word hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud after weeks of careful avoidance. Carol saw the impact it had on Alexander, the way his breath caught and his eyes widened with something that might have been wonder. Carol, he said, her name a prayer on his lips. I love you, she said simply, the truth finally freed from the constraints of propriety and fear. I love this place, this life we've built together. I love watching you teach my children to be strong and capable. I love the peace I feel here, the sense of belonging I've never had anywhere else. Alexander crossed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've loved you since that first night when you stood up to those wolves to protect your children. But I can't ask you to sacrifice their future for my happiness. You're not asking, Carol replied, covering his hands with her own. I'm choosing. We're choosing. This is our future, Alexander, all of us together. The kiss that followed was inevitable, a seal on the decision that had been building between them for weeks. It was tender and desperate and full of promise, a declaration of love that transcended practical considerations and social expectations. When they finally broke apart, Carol could see tears in Alexander's eyes, this strong mountain man finally allowing himself to believe in the possibility of happiness after so many years of self-imposed exile. The company man is waiting for an answer, she said softly. Then let's go give Hiep one, Alexander replied, his arms sliding around her waist in a gesture of support and partnership. They rode together to the old trapper's cabin where William Sanchez had made his camp, the children and Henry following behind on foot. Carol felt a strange sense of completion as they approached the place where their journey had begun, where Alexander had first found them dying in the snow and made the decision to save them. Sanchez was waiting with obvious impatience, his city clothes already showing the effects of a night spent in wilderness conditions. His expression grew wary as he saw Alexander beside Carol, clearly recognizing that the dynamic had changed since their previous encounter. Mrs. Wood, he said formally, I trust you've had time to consider the company's generous offer. I have, Carol replied, her voice steady and sure, and I'm declining it. Sanchez's facade of politeness cracked completely. Mrs. Wood, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. This is your children's future we're discussing. No, Carol said firmly, this is my family's future, and we've chosen to build it here, together. The mining company representative's eyes narrowed as he looked between Carol and Alexander, clearly calculating his next move. The offer won't be extended again, he said coldly. This is your last chance to provide properly for your children. My children are provided for, Carol replied. They have a home, a family, and people who love them. That's worth more than any amount of money your company could offer. Alexander stepped forward slightly, his presence a quiet but unmistakable statement of support. I think the lady's made her position clear, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man comfortable with confrontation. Sanchez mounted his horse with obvious frustration. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Wood. Don't come crying to the company when you realize what you've given up. I won't, Carol said simply, watching him ride away with a sense of finality that felt like freedom. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Carol felt Alexander's hand slip into hers, warm and strong and reassuring. Around them, the mountains stretched toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue and vast, full of promise and possibility. No regrets? Alexander asked quietly. Carol looked at her children, saw Emma's proud smile, and Jacob's excited chatter about their adventure. Saw Mary and Samuel playing happily in the snow, while Henry Lopez watched over them with grandfatherly affection. She thought of the life they would build together in this beautiful, harsh, generous wilderness, of the love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. None, she said, meaning it completely. This is home. Alexander's smile was like sunrise over the mountain peaks, bright and warming and full of new beginnings. Then let's go home, he said, and Carol knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together as a family forged not by blood or law, but by choice and love, and the unshakable bonds that form between people who have saved each other's lives in all the ways that matter. The mountains watched over them as they made their way back to the cabin, these peaks that had witnessed so much human struggle and triumph, so many stories of survival and redemption. And in their ancient silence, they seemed to offer a blessing on this new chapter. This family that had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to stay, to build something lasting in a place where only the strongest and most determined could thrive. Carol Wood had come to these mountains as a desperate woman fleeing tragedy with 4 children and nothing left to lose. She was leaving as someone entirely different, a woman who had found her strength, her purpose, and her place in the world. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful, and it was hers to keep forever.